Um, so it's about that time. Midnight is like freakishly close. We're about 3 weeks out, 3 to 4 weeks out from the expansion coming out, and a couple more weeks after that will be the season. And so Blizzard should be, and arguably is, starting to kind of like rein in some, numbers. They're fixing bugs kind of on the back end. They are trying to tune appropriately. And in this video, I just want to like rant very quickly about just the state of tanks, how I think they're performing, some of the things that I like and dislike going into midnight, and just kind of giving you a brief overview. Now, in the very near future, I do plan on doing a final tank comparison video, and I also plan on doing like extensive guides both with classes and for dungeons going into midnight. So obviously keep an eye out for that. So this is going to be a little bit more, this video is like a little bit more laissez-faire. I'm just going to kind of yap for a bit. Starting off, we have Brewmaster. Brewmaster over the course of beta has been like a fairly competitive tank. There's been a lot of bugs, and there still are, but the class is shaping up to be really, really strong. Now, the fan favorite right now has to be Shadowpan. Shadowpan is playing extraordinarily well. The Flurry Strike mechanic, while I do think it's slightly annoying in terms of like the VFX. I think if you don't play with game sounds on, or maybe you do like them, the Flurry Strike playstyle is so much better going into midnight. It gives you extremely consistent damage. It's very predictable damage. It's just based on auto attacks. So you're being rewarded for like making sure you have melee uptime as often as possible. It's also just an extremely durable tank. You're just passively taking less damage than something like Master of Harmony would, just because of your defensive talents in the hero talent tree. With the recent buffs and just talent changes over the course of beta to Keg Smash becomes one of your strongest abilities in both single target and AoE, which I think a lot of people have been kind of craving for a long period of time. Unfortunately, the kind of takeaway, or the thing that we're losing, is the consistency. Brewmaster right now on beta is playing, I feel like it plays a little bit more similarly to Prot Warrior, where you're more like reacting to procs. And so you Keg Smash as often as you can, and then when you're playing your Apex talent, you're like playing this Gamba game where you're praying for resets on your Keg Smash, and Keg Smash being strong makes it a priority in all situations. And so instead of like going Keg Breath, Blackout, Tiger Palm, and insert like additional abilities like in the past, it's now like Keg Breath, and then as you're doing this, you're purifying and hitting your brews, and you're praying that Keg Smash just reset. So it's like you're hoping that it's going to be Keg Breath, Keg Breath, Keg Breath, Keg Breath. And then you're playing this game of like, okay, I'm now going to use Fortifying Brew to guarantee a reset, and then I'm going to use Black Ox Brew to gamble for a reset, and then I didn't hit, so I'm going to gamble again by hitting Purifying Brew. Oh, I did hit, so I get to Keg Smash again into Breath. And this playstyle I think is enjoyable. I've been having a fun time doing it, but getting used to the inconsistency is taking like a lot of effort because it's just something that I'm not used to, and I'm sure Brewmaster players who've been playing it for a long time are also not really used to or comfortable with. With that being said, it's doing really well. I think there's some tuning adjustments that they could implement to kind of pull some things in line. There's also still a bug with like Facepalm not working, so Facepalm is just like not amping your damage, so you have to like path around it. But yeah, Shadowpan I think is probably the most enjoyable tank for me, and I think a lot of players who normally don't play Brewmaster have been having a lot of fun on it, especially if they're used to kind of playing a more reactionary style. Now, Master of Harmony also got some recent sizable buffs. Now, I don't think it fixes the inherent issues with the spec, but it does make it actually a little bit more competitive if you're interested in playing it. Now, the problem is that there's no ability in your kit that is like a powerful, like an extremely powerful button. You're losing out on modifiers from the Shadowpan tree by not playing Shadowpan that make Keg Smash just an average button. Breath of Fire actually ends up doing way more damage than Keg Smash in like large AoE. Now, this won't be true in like single target, but like in large AoE pulls, for example, like in Algathar, Breath of Fire tends to be like a little bit stronger, which is fine. But with Keg Smash being so weak, it makes threat feel like just awkward on pull. With Shadowpan, you have Keg, then you have Breath, and then you have Flurry Strikes doing the majority of your damage all evenly. But with Master of Harmony, it's like Breath is so high above Keg Smash and then Aspect of Harmony and then other abilities that it's like really low. Also, the removal of the 20% damage amp makes the class feel like less bursty on pull, and it's now like a ramp-based spec. So just in case you haven't been following along, your Coalesced Vitality is no longer only being applied via Celestial Brew or Celestial Infusion usages. It's now being applied whenever you Keg Smash, which is fine. But the problem with that is like you're just always applying the dot, but you're no longer getting a damage amp when the dot is applied. So it's just you're a dot class now is what it ultimately ends up feeling like, which makes it take longer to like when you are in combat and you're trying to like spread your debuff around to hit all the targets, your damage isn't being spread properly. It's not being cleaved off. It's like slowly spreading from target to target as you deal damage to your main primary target. There's also the issue with like your harmonic surge buff. Because of the way that the Apex talent plays, there's friction where you can keg and breath so often, especially playing Master of Harmony, where you have like additional brew usages through like Celestial Infusion, where you don't really want to ever hit Tiger Palm. And when that's the case, then you're not consuming the Harmonic Surge stacks. And if you were consuming the Harmonic Surge stacks, like you can make the argument, like maybe in single target or smaller pulls, it's competitive, if not better. But when you take into like the larger pulls, it's rough. It feels really bad. You're sitting on these stacks. And I think that's a design issue. I know someone actually made the comment where like I'm focusing too much on the stack consumption or lack thereof. I think it's just an inconsistent design philosophy. When you gain a stack that does damage by consuming the stack, for the last 21 years in WoW, generally consuming that stack would take priority. But the fact that like in large pulls or even in relatively smaller pulls, that's not a priority, that's a problem. And I think they need to address that at some point in the next couple of weeks before Midnight actually launches. Because right now, I just think it's not great. But if you are wondering, like damage wise, great. Healing wise, also really durable. It's just because of the threat and the damage allocation in Mythic Plus specifically, it just feels rough, in my opinion. Anyways, I don't want to rant about Brewmaster too much. I'm gonna kind of talk about the other tanks. Probably won't be as long, but let's just jump into like VDH, for example. So VDH is a very interesting spec or a class because I think it's very dumbed down and it's still really strong. There were some really weird interactions with Revel and Pain for Annihilator specifically that were cropping up, and Blizzard finally addressed them in the most recent build. And in doing so, they actually buffed the amount of fire damage absorb, the percentage. And so now Revel and Pain actually ends up being one of your strongest heals, if not the strongest, especially in like really large AoE, as long as you're using Fiery Brand like relatively on CD. Now Annihilator, it kind of lacks depth. Basically, the idea is that you just fracture and soul cleave spam, and like you'll throw in spirit bombs here and there. But basically, you just want to fracture and soul cleave spam, and then you're preying on a couple of different RNG components. So the first RNG component is fracture. It's a 35% chance that it's going to grant you 1 stack of Voidfall. Now, not a fan of this because I have high rolled. I have gone fracture, like I've gone 3 fractures in a row and I hit every time. So it's like fracture, 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 and then I have big burst damage in AoE. I've also low rolled where I fracture 10 times and I barely hit 3 stacks, or actually less than 3 stacks, because that would actually make sense. So there's a little bit of RNG going on here. What I'm also not a fan of, and I've talked about this in the past before, is that there's still a problem with like munching. And maybe munching is not the right term. Of course, someone's going to correct me in the comments like they always do. But basically, if you fracture and you hit, so I hit and I got a Voidfall stack and I fracture again. Okay, I missed. I did not hit. Boom, I have 2 stacks. But when I hit meta, I will immediately gain 3 stacks of Voidfall. But the problem is I'm at 2, right? And so realistically, I want to hold my meta for optimal damage, and I want to fracture again, and I want to keep fracturing until I hit that 3rd Voidfall. And I finally hit after 3 more fracture casts. And so now I get big burst damage. But the thing is, like, if I needed to hit meta there, what ends up happening is that I would have preferred to just hit meta, but then I lose out on the additional 2 stacks I would have gained. So right here, I'll fracture and then I'll fracture again. I missed both times. This 3rd fracture should hit. Okay, I got it. 35% chance W. But now when I meta, I'm gaining only 2 stacks instead of 3. And so the problem is, like, if you're not paying attention and you're not optimizing, or like you really need to use meta, like you're sacrificing damage, which kind of feels bad. Now, this is obviously like in the grand scheme of things, this really won't matter for 99.9% of players. But it is just an inconsistency that I would like to see fixed. I would like to see the stacks be a separate just spell ID, where like when you meta, you gain 3 stacks, and then if you can gain basically 2 stacks of 3, and so you consume them, if that makes sense. They did something similar with Weapons of Order, or not Weapons of Order, sorry, Flurry Strikes when you use your Black Ox, and like you do a 10 stack Flurry Strike independent of your other Flurry Strikes. And so, like, it's possible. I think they could do it, and it would probably make this class feel a little bit better, but it does feel bad when you're at 2 stacks or you're like, you're at like 1 or 2 stacks, and then you're like, "Oh, well, I have to meta here," or meta just came up, but now I have to hold it, which also feels bad. So outside of that, Annihilator does feel really fun. Your rotation offensively is like really simple, but you just do infinite damage. Now you're gonna lack prio dam, unfortunately. There's nothing in the kit that really like can offer a ton of priority damage outside of things like focused cleave, for example. Um, but because so much of your damage, around 40 to 50% of it, is tied into your like meteors coming down, it means that all of your damage is kind of packed into like AoE and not so much on any kind of focus target, which doesn't matter as much. And you always can play Eldrazi Reaver, which is a good option. So I've been having a lot of fun with this spec, but I think VDH mains and players who like a little bit more complexity are not going to enjoy VDH as much, because you can literally infinitely keep up demon spikes. What that means is that you could macro demon spikes into any and every ability on your bar, and then take demon spikes off, and you can just always have demon spikes active at a 35% or a 35-second cap, and you're good. You're set. You don't have to think about it, and all you have to do is hit Fracture as often as possible, keep up Immo Aura, hit Fiery Brand at regular intervals, and then obviously like make sure you have Sigil Flame active as well, because that's gonna benefit your Revel in Pain talent. I like to complain as a Brewmaster that they lowered the skill ceiling for Brewmaster, but I think VDH got hit a little bit harder, so I'm gonna pour one out tonight during the Super Bowl for all of my my VDH homies. Fun to play, yes. One-dimensional, also yes. So take that how you will. When we move into something like Eldrazi Reaver, I think Eldrazi Reaver is just really undertuned. So Eldrazi Reaver was performing really well through most of beta, but after a bunch of bug fixes and obviously oversights that Blizzard missed, now that those have been reined in and fixed, this is a significantly underperforming specialization. I think the gameplay loop for this hero talent is really good still. You're able to have more Reaver's Glaives at like more often. It used to be tied to the hunt. It's now tied to Sigil of Spite. Sigil of Spite is a much more satisfying button to hit. You can hit it from range, and the hunt oftentimes would get novice VDHs like myself killed. So having more consistent, reliable Reaver's Glaives, insane. Very fun. But there's something wrong with the current tuning. Part of it is like the capped damage, constant nerfs to Reaver's Glaive, Thrill of the Fight being finally like nerfed and fixed. There was a problem where they changed the ability but kept in the old ID. So you were actually like double dipping. You were getting the haste buff and you were getting the damage amp, making Eldrazi Reaver perform extraordinarily well. Now, the one thing I do want to point out really quickly, and I pointed this out on stream yesterday as well, is that currently your Fury of the Eldrazi is not actually popping up at all in the damage meters. And I don't know what that means. So I don't know if we're actually doing good damage and the meters aren't reflecting it properly, or if it's just not working. But the thing is, like, we kind of figured out it's not working. So basically what I'm trying to say is, like, if I drop Sigil of Spite, I get my Empowered Glaive. I throw my Empowered Glaive and I Fracture. I apply the Reaver's Mark, which makes them take more damage, and then when I Soul Cleave, it should do a bunch of little Fury hits, which is good. But if we look at the damage meter, you're not going to see Fury of the Eldrazi. So I don't know if it's not showing up or if it's being like filed underneath Soul Cleave, but that wouldn't make too much sense either. I mean, it did 60k on one cast, so maybe it is being filed underneath. But ultimately, it's just like, it's doing significantly less damage, like 30% less damage than Annihilator, if not more. And so there needs to be some kind of tuning adjustment. I just don't know what that would actually end up looking like. So it does look like it's being filed under Soul Cleave now that I'm like looking at this a little bit closer, because there's no way Soul Cleave would have jumped up that much. But very similarly, your rotation is a little bit more in depth, I would say, versus Annihilator. But the overarching playstyle is like really, really simple. But I do prefer Eldrazi. If I had to choose between the two, tuning, not regarding tuning, like just in terms of playstyle, I think Eldrazi has like a little bit more depth to it, which I think is more enjoyable. You're not only making sure you're keeping up Immo Aura, using Fiery Brand, making sure you're using in meta and Spirit Bomb at the correct stacks, but like you're also using Sigil of Spite, you're throwing your Glaive, you have to hit your buttons in the correct order, you're trying to optimize your soul gen. I think there's a little bit more interest in the Eldrazi playstyle versus Annihilator. Moving on to Warrior. Warrior is like, I feel for warrior players because they recently got nerfed, but I don't think they should have gotten nerfed in terms of the damage department because their damage is like pretty low comparative to other tanks, like a lot lower. And I don't know quite what Blizzard is like doing. They've tied actually a fair bit of power into their Phalanx hero talent, except you only need to take the first node for it to be worthwhile. They recently buffed their defensive capabilities through like things like Indomitable being buffed, Fueled by Violence being kind of knocked back up, but they nerfed Deep Wounds, which is being applied in the Colossus tree from Decimator. And they nerfed like Shield Slam damage, which is really, really weird to me. Because similar to Brewmaster, I think Shield Slam should be your priority in most cases, right? In like playing with our Apex talent, Thunderclap causes your Shield Slam to send out a wave of force. In single target, you also want to make sure you're hitting Shield Slam like on cooldown. And while you still prioritize it, it just feels like it doesn't do significant damage. Like I think the Brewmaster breakdown is really good, where Keg Smash is your top, if not one of your top like damage, and especially in like AoE and single target. Where Protection Warrior, you're gonna find that like Revenge ends up doing more damage than Shield Slam, which is just like really weird to me. Especially as like while it is a spender and spenders should feel good to hit, I think tanks should not be as reliant on spenders as they are on like their core kit, if that makes sense. Protection Warrior also is probably the most similar to how it plays on live because they got the least amount of changes because their heaviest rework actually came in 11.2. So I would say Prot still feels really good to play. It's like extremely tanky. It just doesn't do damage, and that's kind of the biggest issue it's currently having. And I think it simply comes down to there's too much damage tied into Revenge. I don't really have much else to say on Warrior. It's still like just your sword and board tank that charges in, you thunderclap, you shield slam, and then you have shield block active, obviously. Your goal is to maintain ignore pain as often as you can. You want as much uptime on it. And then you just like you hit your CDs on CD and you're just like praying for like big cooldown reduction. When it comes to Colossus, there is this weird issue where previously anger management was every 10 rage. It would reduce the CD on Avatar and Shield Wall by a second, and now it's every 20 rage. So they basically cut down the power of it. So instead of having a 45-second cooldown, it's now like a minute cooldown. And when you're playing Colossus, Demolish also gets cooldown reduction, but it makes it a fairly short cooldown. And the problem that ends up being is like in the War Within, they would essentially line up. But now you either have to like hold Demolish or hold Avatar for those moments if you want to combine them. And so I don't know what the best practice is currently, if it's just like better to send everything on CD as it comes up, or if it's better to sync things together. You obviously will benefit a lot by having like Avatar and then Demoralizing Shout and then a 10 stack Demolish. That's going to have a lot of impact versus just sending a Demolish by itself or sending Avatar by itself. But you also want to be an Avatar because if you have things that give you cooldown reduction, it doesn't make sense to sit on them because you always want to be using them to maximize the amount of uptime you have over the course of an encounter or course of a key. So that little inconsistency is like a little weird, but honestly, playing it in keys, it feels really good. I like Warrior. It's a little slow for my tastes currently. This is always the case with Warrior at the start of a season. You just don't have a lot of haste. There's not a lot of haste to go around, not a lot of secondary stats. So you try to work with what you got. It's a little bit, like I said, it's a little bit slower. Unfortunately, Thane is just like not for me. I think Thane is playing totally fine. You pop Avatar, then you're trying to Thunderclap and Thunderblast as often as possible. Your Shield Slams and Shield Slam resets are fishing for the procs. And you're just trying to, again, maintain Avatar as long as possible. That, to me, though, is a little bit too simple. Similar to, like, Aldraki Reaver, I do like a little bit more depth, and I think Colossus offers that more than what you're seeing with something like Mountain Thane. I did an Algothar test, and you've probably been seeing footage, so up to this point, if you've been watching this far, kudos to you, because this is going to be a long fucking video. They both do fine. They both do well, and this pull that I'm doing in Algothar is a double lasher pull, so there's a fair bit of targets. It's very tanky. It's very sturdy. It just doesn't do a lot of damage. I'm expecting to see some type of tuning in this department in the near future, but we'll see. We will see. All right, I'm going to have a lot of hot takes for Death Knight, so please be nice to me in the comments. My first terrible take is Consumption is so fucking fun to hit. I love hitting Consumption. I was saying this on stream, but like it feels dirty, Like it feels like you're edging in like the worst way possible. You stand there getting your ass beat. You try to use it like when you're at full health, but by the time you actually finish the empowered cast, you're at like 10% health, and then you full heal from the consumption cast. and it does a ton of damage. Now, it does take away a little bit from Blood Plague if you're not playing around it properly, which I don't think I am. But holy shit. Not only consumption, but if you're also playing Carnage, which is the capstone talent underneath it, you have the chance. It's a very small chance and it doesn't happen regularly, but when you have it happen like a really big pull and you go like back-to-back consumptions, especially like right after or during your Dancing Room Weapon window, holy shit, dude, it actually claps. Death Knight can do so much damage in large AoE. Now, with that being said, I do think Death Knight has a couple of drawbacks. And I didn't mention this with VDH, and I meant to. I actually kind of mentioned it. I like foreshadowed it, but then I didn't fucking actually deliver. I don't like the Apex talent. I don't like relying on RNG that's inconsistent to give me a defensive that's really powerful. Dancing Room Weapon is really powerful, and like for VDH, like I said, meta is really powerful, and you're hoping for those resets with Untethered Rage. Dance of Midnight, similar kind of thing going on. If you get fortunate enough and you get kind of back to back, or you get high uptime on your rune weapons, you could high roll, you could low roll. You feel good, you feel tanky, but there's times where like you're kind of sweating and you're like, man, I really hope this next Heart Strike or like this next Marrow Rend gives me a proc, and it doesn't, and you're like, fuck, and then you die. Or you get really low and you're like, your butt's clenched. So I'm not a huge fan of being reliant on this. I know I've been saying that Death Knight is generally like pretty good, and I do like the feel of it over the course of beta, but I do miss the cooldown reduction. I am with most of you. I don't miss Tombstone, I don't miss Bone Storm, but I do miss Dancing Rune Weapon cooldown reduction. Now, I will say that it was inconsistent. I wasn't a huge fan when like you were fighting like Shade of Medivh in Karazhan. It's like when you have a boss that only casts spells at you and you can't actually reduce the cooldown on your thing because you're not consuming bone shield charges because you're not getting meleeed, that's when it feels bad. But I think for the most part, missing out on the cooldown reduction does feel just not great. It would be nice if they like reduced this down to like a 1 minute cooldown and you just had like a consistent 1 minute CD. Obviously they'd have to tune a lot of things if they did that, but I just feel like with Fort being 2 minutes and then Dancing Room being 1.5, and like that's really it. Like, yeah, you have AMS and Lichborn and stuff, but it's just like you're so reliant on your parry chances of Death Knight that not having high uptime on this always will feel bad. Deathbringer is feeling both Sand Lane and Deathbringer, in my opinion, are feeling great. The only thing that I don't like about Sand Lane that's like glaring is I don't like not hitting Blood Boil and Heart Strike. So when I have to Marrow Rend, it's annoying. Now, luckily, Bone Collector allows us to like Death Grip instead of spending the rune or 2 runes on Marrow Rend or having to awkwardly Death's Caress mid. Like, I hate Death's Caress is a terrible ability as well, and it has a cooldown, which is also terrible. Bone Collector kind of makes up for that. Gore Fiends as like a defensive is also kind of cool. So when you mass grip, especially it's like 10 targets and you mass grip them all together, you gain 10 bone shield charges, which is good. So there's like that's an interesting concept to me, and I really do enjoy playing around it. It's just their single target to me feels really low. Both Sand Lane and Deathbringer single target feels bad. I might not be playing well is also a very valid thing for anyone to say, myself included. So their single target feels a little low, but I do like consumption. I like Bone Collector. I think both of the hero towns feel kind of pretty okay. I do miss a lot. I miss Visceral Strength and its ability to apply Bone Shield charges on Blood Boil. So in larger AoE, you can just like focus on hitting Blood Boil as often as possible. I miss that. But they have fixed a lot of the Runic Power shit. I haven't mentioned that in a while, but Runic Power feels great. Like you just have infinite Runic Power in most cases, as long as you're managing like your resources properly. So yeah, Death Knight is a big W right now. I really enjoy it. I know some Death Knight players, especially anyone who's mained the spec for a long time, and this goes for any tank, is probably disappointed going into Midnight. But I think as someone who's like novice coming into it, I think it feels pretty good. And accessibility is great. And of course, there's always going to be like those little min-max things that will come down the road. So that's Death Knight. Dude, Guardian Druid is kind of sleeper right now. I was pleasantly surprised when I was doing my Algothar testing at how much damage Guardian Druid could do. I think right now in large AoE, not necessarily single target. Actually, you can make the argument in single target. I've seen Dorky do some crazy shit in keys, but their damage, especially as Druid of the Claw, is so high. And the recent buffs that they got to things like Moonless Night, just incredible. Now, I think the class still has glaring issues. Threat is a massive problem right now in keys, especially because you're still really dependent on Ravage procs. And this has a problem with like, yeah, you can kind of min-max it by dropping combat between packs, but that's not really how Mythic Plus is designed, or at least at a competitive level where you kind of always want to chain. So threat is still kind of an issue because you want to make sure not only you have a Ravage available versus like Raise or Maul, but with the buff and how potent Moonless Night is now, you definitely want Moonfire on as many, if not all targets in a pull. And so this is interesting because it's starting to like make us dabble in something like Twin Moonfire and Galactic Guardian. Being able to spread out Moonfires to all targets in a pull or as many targets or priority mobs allows Raze to hit even harder and Thrash to hit harder and all this other stuff. So the buffs to Moonless Night, really good. And if you get like good RNG with Moonfire going on the right targets and then good Ravage procs, you can just do some insane damage. Now in an Algothar test, it obviously makes sense playing playing like this, and you can be aggressive and like you're not really worried about threat. But threat is still a major issue in keys because of the reliance on Ravage to do big damage, especially if you're playing with like a Devourer who just wants to like fucking start doing damage immediately because that's just how their class is designed. Now, what I like, and I forgot to mention this with Prot Warrior, is that I do like when Apex talents are nice but not necessary. And Guardian Druid is kind of in that spot where like you can play 1 point, you can play 2, 3, or 4 points. Though it's been this like interesting thing where like people are putting like 2 or 3 points in, sometimes just 1, and then you can put more talents into other things like more defensive talents, more AOE, more single target, etc. The playstyle shift and addition to things like Killing Blow and Harnessed Rage are, I think, top tier. I've mentioned this in previous videos. I'm going to mention it again. I think these two abilities are really great and actually has made Guardian Druid one of the it moved it from one of the easiest, simple, boring tanks to play to actually a tank you have to think about its interactions, right? You have an extra Mango Charge, which is already great, but on top of that, when you use your spender, when you use Maul, Ravage, or Raise, depending on like your hero talent or like your talents in general, you now have increased activations of Gore, and then like that has further cascading things that are going to interact with your kit in a unique way. Also, spending said Rage does more additional damage based on if you have an abundance of that resource. And so now you have to think about, do I Ironfur? Do I Ravage? Do I Frenzied Regen? Like these things are now like, you don't just macro Ironfur into all of your abilities and spam it and never hit any button. You now actually have like interesting choices global to global. I've heard good things about Bear from people who have been playing, and I know Dorky's actually been saying that it's been really good. Now again, like I said, there's still issues with like threats. There's actually various bugs that are still going on. So hopefully they fix that soon. Now moving slightly just towards Elun's Chosen. Unfortunately, Elun's Chosen just feels weaker. Now, similar to Master of Harmony Brewmaster, it does ramp eventually. Its damage can eventually like not catch up to Druid. I think Druid just does way more damage. Like Druid of the Cloud does way more damage, but Elun's Chosen can eventually get to that point, but it does require you to actually get Moonfire on most, if not all, your targets. The rotation also for Elun's Chosen just feels a little bit more mundane. Like you're really just like thrashing for CDR and arcane damage, and then you're Moonfiring. And between those two spells, like, you'll weave in a mangle. But it feels like your offensive rotation is really just boring, really bland, really bleak. And like, yeah, you'll dump into Raze or Maul or whichever talent you end up playing. But like things like Moonless Night, Moonfire, and Thrash end up doing like the majority of your damage, and it takes time for that to ramp. Like I said, like Moonless Night is only effective when you have Moonfire on most, if not all, of your targets in a pull. So I think there's still some tuning that needs to happen, whether Druid of the Claw gets knocked down or Elun's Chosen gets knocked up. Knocked up. But I do think Druid of the Claw is looking stronger, but I think both have threat issues. Anyways, moving on, let's jump over to Paladin. So Paladin had this really weird arc over the course of beta up to this point, where it went from being unplayable to being God to being average to being now like slightly below average. I do think it's one of the weaker tanks in the current state. Defensively, the nerfs that they did this last week just didn't make sense because it wasn't immortal. It wasn't a god. You had to play it well. They nerfed Shield of the Righteous armor, and that has made the tank feel very squishy in these like relatively simple pulls. Now, in my Algothar testing up to this point, Templar, unfortunately, is back to that kind of similar spot where it's just not, I like can't live the full pull. I cycled through defensives probably too fast. I've only done a couple of attempts, so I'm going to keep trying. But basically, I couldn't live long enough. It does really good damage. It still does really high burst damage, but they have reined that in. Templar and Lightsmith feel pretty okay, but it feels like it's in a spot where you need a little bit of intervention from your healer, especially during certain tank busters, especially during bleeds. Bubble is strong. Guardian of Ancient Kings is very, very strong as well, but it is a longer cooldown, and while you are getting cooldown reduction, still like a pretty long CD at 3 minutes. And there aren't many more defensive options I could lean into that would make sense. And so I think the tank needs a little bit of help defensively still. And I just think like armor, I don't know. Again, I don't know why they nerfed their armor because I think they need a armor buff now at this point. So I'm hoping to see that change. Now, I think, and while those were the negatives, the class has insane utility still. Having a consistent interrupt, very, very powerful. Having off healing, powerful off healing. Additional tools like lay on hands, which also could grant additional armor. Having things like blessing of protection or blessing of spell warding, both very, very good. Hand of sacrifice immunity or dispels for poisons. Those are all good, and obviously as a dispel, blinding light, hodge, these are all great things. Now, in a scenario where I'm pulling 20 mobs in an Algothar Academy on a 15 solo is definitely not how it's going to operate in an actual key when you have a healer and you have additional CC and mobs die not in less than 3 minutes, in like a minute or whatever, 45 seconds, 30 seconds. When pulls go down, the tank feels fine. When you have to live on your own, that's where I'm starting to kind of like notice like glaring issues. So I think the tank is still good. And I think for players who are looking for like an interesting, potentially good carrying class, Paladin is always going to be like the king of that. But you should always play what you like. So that's like my other take. I'm kind of ranting at this point. The last thing I want to mention is its playstyle. It has a lot of buttons technically, but you're gonna solder more often, Shield of the Righteous, more often than not. And with Grand Crusade and the importance of Judgment and Avenger Shield, your rotation, especially in wings, is literally Avenger Shield, Judgment, Avenger Shield, Judgment, Avenger Shield, Judgment, Avenger. Like that's your rotation. When you are out of those things, you default to Blessed Hammer or Hammer of Righteous, depending on like whatever talent you're playing. Probably Blessed Hammer though in AOE or in Mythic Plus. So the class's rotation is like relatively simple. And the skill ceiling, I think, is really high. It's really important to use your utility. It's really important to use your defensives and cycle through them appropriately. It's really important to target the right targets to make sure you're interrupting with Avenger Shield. Tab targeting with Avenger Shield is also a good way to keep things under control. So the skill ceiling with Paladin in general is really high. So if you're looking for a tank that requires you to play well, this is it. So take that how you will. So yeah, but I do think Lightsmith and Templar are both in a fine state. I think the buffs to Templar helped it. The issue that I'm currently having with Templar is that we just do not have enough crit to go around. And while Mastery isn't as important anymore because they nerfed its tie to its defensive power with Consecration, you could maybe stack a little bit more crit, which I'm definitely not doing on beta, but having only 15% crit versus like having 30+% crit like I do on live, Templar, you are not getting enough Hammer of Lights to get enough Sacrosanct Crusades, which is a lot less survivability and a lot less damage. And so I don't think Templar is going to be the play as of right now. And that's not because the class is bad or like the spec is bad or the hero talent specifically. It's just simply like we don't have secondary stats. So just play Lightsmith. But besides that, I think that's really all the things I had to talk about with Templar, like or Paladin, I should say. I will be doing a more in-depth analysis and looking at like statistics and numbers and all of this other stuff in probably the next week or two. I'm waiting for like the final tuning to kind of like be clear. Like it still feels like a couple of specs and a couple of hero talents need bug fixes, proper adjustments. So keep an eye out for that. But I just wanted to yap for a bit. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.